Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the IU Kokomo Library for Dr. Paul Renfro's lecture. We're delighted to welcome all of you to this special event. This program was made possible through the generous support of the Addison, Locke, Roach Memorial Speaker Fund, IU Kokomo Library, led by its dean, Yanhe, and the Kokomo Howard County Public Library. We're also grateful to everyone at IU Kokomo, the Public Library, and the Howard County Historical Society for their help in planning and promoting today's event. Special thanks go to Crystal Jones, Vice Chancellor for University Relations, for facilitating this event, and to Chancellor Dr. Mark Canada, EVCAA's Dr. Scott Jones for their continued support. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Dr. Alan Safianow, who was my predecessor. He came to IU Kokomo in 1971, and he taught American history for the next 37 years. He was involved in the development of the History Political Science degree, the IUK Film Society, the IUK International Festival, and he served as advisor to the History Club. Much of his research and publications have centered on the activity of the Indiana Ku Klux Klan. He was also a volunteer at the Howard County Historical Society for many years, which continued after his retirement. He worked on several oral history projects there, including the Ryan White Project. After his move to Bloomington in 2014, he continued to remain active, assisting in the resettlement of refugees and serving as a volunteer tutor at the local library. Please join me in welcoming back to campus our great friend, Alan Safianow.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that very nice introduction. And I want to say what a pleasure it is to be back at IUK. I've not been back here for at least 5-6 years, and I'm amazed at all the wonderful changes that have taken place. And I'm really very appreciative of those who helped organize this group, including IUK, of course, the Public Library, and the Howard County Historical Society. And it's a special pleasure to have the privilege of introducing Paul Renfro. And although we've had considerable correspondence about his book, and I even got to read a draft of it before it was published, this is the first time we've met in person, so that's a real treat for us. And Paul is an associate professor of history at Florida State University, and he's the author of 2 books, Stranger Danger, and more recently, The Life and Death of Ryan White, AIDS and Inequality in America, which earned honorable mention at the Florida Book Awards. He's currently working on 2 new books, one on the Atlanta youth murders, and the second, A Cultural Biology of Matthew Shepard. And there are several things which impressed me about Paul's book. One was his extremely fair-minded and nuanced account of the difficulties and controversies Howard County faced in the 1980s when Ryan White, a young teenage hemophiliac who had acquired AIDS after taking a tainted blood product, was denied admission to attend Western Middle School in person. This drew considerable national and international attention, much of it rather unfavorable. Secondly, Ryan emerged as an iconic figure, drawing the support of celebrities such as Michael Jackson, Elton John, Elizabeth Taylor, and in 1988 he gave testimony before President Reagan's Commission on the HIV epidemic. Shortly after his death in 1990, Congress adopted the Ryan White CARE Act that provided emergency assistance and other supports to low-income individuals, families, and communities that were affected by the HIV epidemic. And Paul acknowledges the positive, iconic role that Ryan served in the fight against AIDS, but he also points out that during and after Ryan's life, this iconic image was manipulated in a way that tended to discriminate against disadvantaged and discriminate people who were discriminated, people with AIDS. And he raises important questions regarding inclusion, equity, and social justice. Lastly, Paul has made extensive use of local sources, including interviews from the Howard County Historical Society's Oral History Collection, and also from Western Middle School Library Collection. And in his acknowledgments in the book, he notes that these materials proved absolutely invaluable in his research. And I see we have a couple of other people who participated with me in the Oral History Project, and I'd like to acknowledge Judy Lausch and Diane Knight. And I think you're really going to find this presentation very worthwhile. So, Paul?
You have my remarks. I want those. Yeah. Let's see. I have an additional copy. Just
There's somewhere. Well,
this is good. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alan. Thank you all for being here. It's really such an honor to be here with you today. I wanted to acknowledge a few people. I want to acknowledge all of you for being here, but I want to give special thanks to Chancellor Mark Canada, Chris Darr, Michelle Ennis, Renee Gerstenberger, Yen He, Sarah Heath, Crystal Jones, and of course Alan Safianow. I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes or so, after which I'll gladly answer any questions you might have, and I think Alan has called dibs on the first question. So let me jump right into it. In a 1993 interview with Playboy, the playwright, activist, and ACT UP co-founder Larry Kramer expressed his admiration for Ryan White. "I think little Ryan White probably did more to change the face of this illness and to move people than anyone," declared Kramer. Ryan was courageous by confronting the issue and saying, "In your face, here I am, and here AIDS is. I am the face of AIDS." How did a skinny teenage boy with hemophilia from Indiana become the most recognizable person with AIDS in the United States, if not the world? And how did he become the namesake of the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency, or CARE Act, which delivered much-needed federal funding for HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment beginning in 1990? The answer, in a word, is innocence. Ryan White became a household name in 1985 after he was barred from attending his middle school on account of his illness. Because Ryan had acquired HIV through contaminated blood products, and thus, quote, through no fault of his own, as many observers put it, he differed significantly from the populations most intimately associated with HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, namely men who had sex with men and people who used intravenous drugs. Ryan therefore emerged as the seemingly unassailable face of AIDS, to use Kramer's formulation. A white, middle-class, sexually non-threatening, Midwestern teenager, and a curious kind of celebrity. The virus now known as HIV has lived in human bodies since at least the early 20th century. Researchers have pinpointed 1920s Kinshasa, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as a key site in the early transmission of HIV. It stands to reason, then, that HIV and AIDS probably appeared on the North American continent before the late 1960s. Still, scientists identify Robert Rayford as the first person to die of AIDS-related causes in the United States in the year 1969. A black teenager who never left his hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, Rayford may have contracted HIV while performing sex work, or he may have been sexually assaulted by someone carrying the virus. When he died on May 16th of 1969, the pathologist who performed his autopsy discovered a set of purplish lesions denoting Kaposi sarcoma, or KS, a rare form of cancer that would become closely associated with AIDS in the 1980s. Injection drug users in the US began contracting HIV during the mid to late 1970s. In New York City, the pervasive intravenous use of heroin and cocaine led to the rapid spread of HIV in the late 70s and early 80s. Restrictions on access to sterile needles and other injection equipment exacerbated the crisis, which remains the largest HIV outbreak in injecting drug users in human history. In response to this epidemic, IV drug users in New York City adopted safer injection practices, reducing syringe sharing and increasing the availability and use of sterile injection equipment. With the legalization of needle exchange programs in the early 1990s, the New York State Department of Health, in conjunction with activists and the New York City government, began funding and issuing licenses for such programs. These measures helped dramatically curb the spread of HIV among people who injected drugs. Nevertheless, in the 1970s, intravenous drug users garnered little sympathy from the public, as their deaths were often dismissively blamed on the so-called junkie flu or the dwindles. It wasn't until 1981 that the virus now known as HIV entered the American public consciousness. At that moment, Americans learned about a series of Kaposi sarcoma cases affecting young gay men in Los Angeles and New York City. And it wasn't until 1985 that the media and political class found a so-called poster boy for the epidemic. That poster boy was Ryan White. Jeannie White had been in labor for nearly 23 hours in Kokomo's St. Joseph Memorial Hospital before she finally gave birth to her son on December 6, 1971. But even after she delivered Ryan, named for actor Ryan O'Neal, the pain didn't stop, she later recalled. I felt like I was still in labor. She bled profusely and lost consciousness. Doctors, quote, sent helicopters all over Indiana to bring back Rh negative blood for her, some 13 pints of blood overall. Jeannie White's experience mirrored that of her newborn son, who bled incessantly following his circumcision. Ryan was subsequently transported to Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, where a hematologist diagnosed him with classic or severe hemophilia. Hemophilia is a rare, often inherited bleeding disorder that prevents the efficient clotting of blood, meaning people with hemophilia bleed excessively and sometimes unexpectedly. They also bruise easily and frequently experience pain and swelling in their joints. Hemophilia remained a dismal, painful, and highly lethal disease well into the 20th century. By the end of the Second World War, however, blood and plasma transfusions had become routine and relatively safe, as scholar Susan Resnick writes. And coagulation research undertaken during this period led to the use of cryoprecipitate, a cold precipitate of plasma that contained a high concentration of clotting material, AHF or factor VIII, as a treatment for bleeding episodes. The emergence of cryoprecipitate helped inaugurate a so-called golden era for hemophilia research and treatment, which paved the way for the development of easily accessible concentrates. These treatments, such as factor VIII, could be administered at home or on the go, so those with hemophilia could avoid onerous trips to the hospital in the event of a bleeding episode. Ryan White was born in this so-called golden era for research and treatment. But as liberating as factor VIII and other self-administered treatments may have been for people with hemophilia in this moment, some proved riskier than others, even before the eruption of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s. Factor VIII and other concentrates pooled blood and plasma from thousands of donors. And this is an illustration from the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. Who's been to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis? Yes, it's fabulous. So each injection therefore introduced the blood cells of thousands of people into a user's body. By 1983, over 80% of people with severe hemophilia who had been treated with concentrate showed, quote, serologic evidence of previous exposure to hepatitis B antigen. Although many, quote, considered the risk of hepatitis to be an acceptable price to pay for the benefits of AHF concentrate. Ryan White tested positive for hepatitis B in November of 1984, just before his AIDS diagnosis. And as HIV spread in the early 1980s, before the pervasive use of heat treatment to eliminate HIV in the blood supply, Factor VIII represented both a lifeline, to use the words that people are using at the time, and a potential death sentence for those with hemophilia. Ryan started to feel chronically ill in the summer of 1984. By the time he turned 13 on December 6th of that year, he had reached a breaking point. His mother, Jeannie, took him to the hospital in Kokomo, where an x-ray revealed that he had pneumonia in both lungs. Antibiotics failed to treat the pneumonia, so Ryan was transferred to Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. There, Jeannie and Ryan met with Dr. Martin Kleeman, an expert in pediatric infectious diseases. Given Ryan's severe hemophilia and his reliance on Factor VIII, Kleeman suspected that his pneumonia was viral rather than bacterial, hence the ineffectiveness of the antibiotic regimen. Specifically, Kleeman believed that pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or PCP, was the culprit. Alongside Kaposi sarcoma, PCP served as one of the rare opportunistic infections that alerted clinicians to the existence of a new syndrome in the early 1980s. A KS or PCP diagnosis often worked as a de facto AIDS diagnosis, particularly before the introduction of a reliable HIV antibody testing regime in the mid to late 80s. Thus, when a biopsy conducted on Ryan's lungs came back positive for PCP, it essentially confirmed that he had AIDS. The American public first encountered Ryan White in July of 1985, when officials representing the Western School Corporation in Rocheville prohibited the teenager from attending classes at Western Middle School. The decision to deny entry to Ryan might have remained a relatively minor local controversy had it not come down just as the world was learning of actor Rock Hudson's bout with AIDS. Though Hudson had been diagnosed the previous year in 1984, news of his illness only broke in late July 1985. He thus became, as the Indianapolis Star put it, the first person with international recognition to announce he has the disease. Hudson's fame made his illness noteworthy and shocking, but so too did his embodiment of normative masculinity and heterosexuality on the big screen, especially during Hollywood's golden age. So news of Hudson's diagnosis heightened public interest in the AIDS epidemic and stoked fears about the disease's movement beyond the established risk groups, the so-called 4Hs: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians. And just days after Ryan White was barred from attending classes at Western Middle School, the Indianapolis Star ran a front-page article next to a story about Ryan, highlighting the public's growing concerns about AIDS. Now a household word, the headline read, "It's invading the straight world." Soon, Rocheville, Kokomo, and the small communities surrounding them became the subjects of great national and international attention. And because AIDS was now, quote, a household word, Ryan White almost instantly became a household name, a widely celebrated figure with a small army backing his bid to return to school. By the fall of 1985, the inclusion of students with HIV or AIDS in the classroom had become a contentious national issue. Debates about children with HIV or AIDS in schools raged in the courtroom, the press, and the interpersonal sphere, from Connecticut to the Bronx to Florida, where locals tormented and eventually banished the Ray triplets, who also had hemophilia. But the Ryan White case would loom the largest. Ryan and his family endured a lengthy courtroom battle that dragged on into the new year, 1986. In February of that year, Indiana's State Board of Special Education Appeals ruled that Ryan could return to school if he received medical clearance from Howard County's public health officer, Dr. Alan Adler. Adler ultimately determined that Ryan's, quote, present medical condition is such that he should not pose any threat to his fellow students, teachers, and others. And even though Ryan, quote, had the full right to attend classes in person the next day, Adler requested a 1-week delay, in part because of a surge in flu cases at Western Middle School, and in part because school officials needed some additional time to prepare for Ryan's return. During that week, the White family collaborated with the Howard County Health Department and Western School Corporation on a set of precautionary guidelines designed, quote, to facilitate the re-enrollment of the AIDS child to the school setting. These guidelines were excessive, to say the least, and they were completely out of step with the scientific consensus on HIV and AIDS. Their main purpose, however, was, quote, to dispel a lot of the fears swirling around Kokomo and Rushville at the time, and really around the world, related to the communicability of the virus. Ryan would use separate bathroom facilities, eat with, quote, single-service disposable utensils, and toss his trash in a separate bin, the contents of which would be double-bagged and incinerated. With these precautionary yet unnecessary measures in place, Ryan White returned to school on the morning of Friday, February 21st, 1986. Reporters and television cameras were prohibited from entering Western Middle School that day, but that did not deter members of the press corps from camping out in the snow. According to the Indianapolis Star, at least 50 journalists, photographers, and camera persons waited outside. The media presence was so overwhelming that school officials opened up a, quote, special waiting area for news media personnel at the adjacent Western Elementary School. By most accounts, Ryan's experience during his first day back was pleasant and relatively uneventful. It was a lot of fun, he explained in a media scrum immediately after the final school bell had rung. I'm glad to be back. When asked how his fellow students had treated him, Ryan responded, just like anybody else. And when he asked what he was, quote, looking forward to now, he replied, well, getting back to normal life. For at least a moment then, Ryan's life seemed relatively normal, and he wanted things to stay that way. Yet the opposition mounted by a segment of the community would interrupt Ryan's brief flirtation with normality. Braving the wintry conditions, a small group of students from Western High School picketed outside of Western Middle School. One of the high schoolers, a young man wearing aviator-style sunglasses and sporting a hair metal hairdo, carried a sign that read, "Students Against AIDS." In a clip that aired on the CBS Evening News, that same young man declared, "I ain't got nothing against Ryan or anything. I just don't want AIDS in our school." As ABC's Jerry King noted on World News Tonight, however, this small, brief demonstration against Ryan's return to classes paled in comparison to, quote, the main protest, which took the form of absenteeism. A staggering 42% of the student body stayed home that day, quote, to avoid being exposed to the 14-year-old victim of AIDS, as reporter Jim Cummins put it on the NBC Nightly News. Cummins' story then featured two local parents whose 4 children had, quote, stayed at home and watched television at their parents' behest. "It's a deadly disease, and I don't want to take that chance with my children," the father of these children explained to a gaggle of reporters. "If he sneezes or anything, kids can get it," their eldest daughter asserted matter-of-factly but incorrectly. Such opposition to Ryan's February 21st return to Western Middle School, depicted in stark detail in newspapers and on the nightly news, cast negative light on all of the residents of Kokomo and Roucheville and beyond. So too did parents' successful appeal for a temporary injunction barring Ryan White from school on the same day he had returned to Western Middle School. Several members of the Concerned Citizens and Parents of Children Attending Western School Corporation organization filed a petition for a temporary restraining order in Howard County Circuit Court. Judge R. Allen Brubaker ruled in favor of the petitioners on the afternoon of February 21st, transforming what was a joyous and fairly smooth return to classes into an unmitigated disaster for Ryan and his family. They welcomed him back and they gave him a good time today, and I think it's very wrong to take that away from him right now, Jeannie White told viewers of ABC's World News Tonight. While those who sought the injunction against Ryan celebrated Brubaker's decision, they simultaneously undermined their cause by cheering after the judge issued his ruling. As the Kokomo Tribune described it, quote, "The city had been moderately successful in weathering a generally negative opinion the rest of the country apparently had of Kokomo until February 21st. That day, a local judge slapped a restraining order on Ryan's return to school. But what appeared to enrage a national television news audience more than the decision itself was that school patrons who sought the injunction left the courtroom cheering and flashing thumbs-up signs. A swift backlash ensued. Ryan White has put Kokomo, population 45,500 at the time, on the national media map, Rogers Worthington wrote in an early draft of one of his Chicago Tribune articles, and Kokomo is none too happy with the limelight and a national image it sees as one of unsophisticated bully. As the Kokomo Tribune put it, almost immediately after the February 21st hearing, quote, "generally hostile letters from around the nation flooded the city." These letters and other responses spoke not only to the high-profile nature of Ryan's legal saga, they also revealed the emergence of a cultural narrative in which Kokomo became increasingly synonymous with ignorance and bigotry, two of the key forces supposedly driving the HIV/AIDS epidemic. If locals could simply learn more about AIDS and treat Ryan with respect and kindness, the thinking went, then all would be well. But given the intense fear and uncertainty surrounding HIV and AIDS at the time, and to a lesser extent now, the resistance that Ryan faced must be situated within its appropriate historical and political context. After all, as I'll suggest throughout the rest of the talk, HIV and AIDS stigma remains firmly entrenched in the United States and indeed throughout the world today. When Ryan finally secured the right to attend classes at Western Middle School in the spring of 1986, it made the resistance to his return seem all the more futile and perhaps all the more foolish. In the wake of his very public legal victory, Ryan and his family embarked on a national publicity tour of sorts. Ryan flew out to New York City to be interviewed on ABC's Good Morning America and to attend a benefit for the recently established American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR. Ryan served as the guest of honor at the lavish AMFAR benefit held at the Jacob Javits Center and co-hosted by actress Elizabeth Taylor and fashion designer Calvin Klein. At the gala, a tuxedoed Ryan and his mother rubbed shoulders with Yoko Ono and New York's Mayor Ed Koch, while Andy Warhol snapped photographs of the mother-son duo, including this one here. By February of the following year, 1987, a month before the formation of ACT UP, Indiana's health commissioner at the time, Woodrow Myers Jr., could confidently assert that Ryan was, quote, "the best known AIDS victim in the United States, if not the world." And crucially, in Myers's words, one who posed, quote, "the lowest possible political risk for elected officials seeking to address the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So Myers' comments testified to Ryan's growing popularity and the power of his perceived innocence, which together would help guarantee the passage of the CARE Act following his death. Ryan White's death and funeral in April of 1990 were media spectacles long foretold. As soon as Ryan entered the national consciousness in mid-1985, his seeming proximity to death shaped his life story, and he was constantly ill. He finally fell ill for the last time while visiting Southern California in late March of 1990. He and his mother promptly returned to Indiana, and he was subsequently hospitalized at Riley. Ryan White passed away on April 8th, 1990. His death was a major national story. In one survey from May of that year, 88% of American adults indicated that they had heard about Ryan White's demise. Even President George H.W. Bush and former President Reagan, not known for their interest in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, publicly commented on Ryan's death. Reagan, for one, penned an obituary for Ryan in the Washington Post. That obituary stressed Ryan's, quote, youthful innocence, and insisted that, quote, there have been too many funerals like his. Although hardly any funerals held for people with AIDS resembled the extravagant ceremony in which Ryan White would be laid to rest. That funeral was held on April 11th in what one reporter called the, quote, Gothic expanse of Second Presbyterian Church in Meridian Hills, an affluent community just north of downtown Indianapolis. If you've ever driven by this church, it's incredibly impressive. Some 1,500 mourners attended the funeral, while hundreds more, unable to secure a spot in the sanctuary, were stranded outdoors in the bitter cold and rain. Unsurprisingly, given Ryan's celebrity status, various stars and dignitaries were in attendance as well. First Lady Barbara Bush sat directly behind the White family, and Michael Jackson sat next to Jeannie White. Jackson had actually flown to Indiana on Donald Trump's private jet. Los Angeles Raiders defensive end Howie Long, singer Elton John, and talk show host Phil Donahue served as pallbearers. Elton John performed his song Skyline Pigeon during the ceremony, a framed photograph of Ryan sitting on his piano. Ryan laid in an open casket at the front of the sanctuary, his body adorned with some of the clothing and accessories he cherished, and through which he channeled his rock star idols, people like Elton John and Bruce Springsteen. His faded jean jacket, worn over a red t-shirt, framed his frail body, while reflective Oakley shades rested on his face. CNN carried the 45-minute ceremony live on air, and all three major broadcast networks showed footage of the service that evening. The elaborate funeral, as I've suggested, was a far cry from the quiet, poorly attended ceremonies held to honor many other people with AIDS. Some AIDS deaths were hardly marked at all. Many funeral home employees simply, quote, refused to touch the bodies of those who died of AIDS-related causes, and that comes from a New York Times piece published at the time. Given the profound stigma attached to the living and lifeless bodies of people with AIDS, members of an ACT UP affinity group called the Marys, taking a cue from artist and activist David Wojnarowicz, began staging what they called political funerals in the early 1990s, in the immediate aftermath of Ryan's death. These ceremonies reflected the desperation of the overwhelming majority of people with AIDS. While Ryan's funeral had all the trappings of a formal memorial service and was legitimated through powerful institutions, the church, the state, the news media, the Marys' political funerals were fugitive insurgent actions, intended to indict these very institutions for ignoring or exacerbating the AIDS crisis. Ryan's highly publicized death and funeral also helped create the political space in which the federal government would allocate much-needed HIV/AIDS funding via the Ryan White CARE Act. As Ryan lay dying at Riley Hospital for Children, the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee dedicated the CARE Act in his honor. The committee's formal report on Senate Bill 2240, published several weeks later after Ryan had died, proclaimed that, quote, young Ryan White changed the world. With dignity, patience, and almost unvarying good cheer, the report read, Ryan introduced to people across America and across the world a face of AIDS that caring human beings could not turn their back upon. This committee report vividly illustrated the power, again, of White's perceived innocence. While caring human beings could apparently spurn other people with AIDS, they could not in good conscience ignore Ryan. To be sure, the CARE Act was quite popular with legislators even before Ryan's name was affixed to the bill. An increasingly visible and militant AIDS movement in the late 80s and early 1990s had prompted a stronger government response to the epidemic. Upon its introduction in early March of 1990, and before it was named for Ryan, Senate Bill 2240 boasted one sponsor and 25 co-sponsors. It secured another 6 co-sponsors in early April. But Ryan's name and image rendered the bill all but unassailable. Calling it the Ryan White CARE Act enabled lawmakers and activists to further, and this is the term that a lot of HIV/AIDS scholars use, to sanitize HIV/AIDS, and in so doing to authorize AIDS funding without incurring the wrath of anti-gay and anti-drug forces. And this is also at the height of the war on drugs. Indeed, attaching Ryan's name to the Senate bill attracted additional co-sponsors, thereby establishing a filibuster-proof majority that would keep Senator Jesse Helms, pictured on top there, at bay. By the time the bill passed a heavily Democratic Senate in May, 66 senators had co-sponsored it, so everyone wants to be associated with this bill. Yet because Ryan was such a potent and popular symbol, the invocation of his name and image by federal lawmakers still proved contentious. Everyone wanted to be on Ryan's side. For Senator Ted Kennedy, pictured at the bottom there, and other supporters of the CARE Act, Orrin Hatch, for instance, even activists who may have privately opposed what one reporter called the use of a politically safe symbol to pass the bill, that meant passing the bill in Ryan's name. For Helms and others like him, that meant protecting White and other so-called innocent victims from gay people, IV drug users, Hollywood elites, and even certain congresspeople. So Helms, through his rhetoric associated with this bill and the deliberations surrounding it, he sought to wrest control of Ryan's name and image away from Kennedy and other CARE Act proponents. Although in one sense he failed, given the wide margins by which the Ryan White CARE Act passed, they also revealed the limits of the politics kind of unleashed by Ryan's story, the politics of innocence. Specifically, Helms identified White as an exceptional person with AIDS who helped direct public attention away from stigmatized groups disproportionately affected by the epidemic, particularly gay men and those who used intravenous drugs. And through this and related observations, Helms reinforced the perceived symbolic and moral distance between White and other, perhaps more typical people with AIDS. And he also successfully promoted policies designed to further police and subjugate those in the latter category. So as the Senate deliberated the proposed Ryan White CARE Act in mid-May 1990, Helms inveighed against, quote, the Hollywood and media crowd, the, quote, homosexual segment of the AIDS lobby, as well as congresspeople and other groups that he claimed were exploiting Ryan White. For Helms, quote, the cynical exploitation of Ryan White served, quote, to mask the political movement behind such legislation. Ryan's name, Helms told his fellow senators, will be invoked over and over again by nefarious forces seeking to pass the CARE Act. The homosexual lobby of America knew the Ryan White story was too good to pass up, charged Helms. Therefore, his struggle and his death could be used to frighten the American public into believing that AIDS is waiting to happen to everyone, even if they do not engage in illegal and or immoral activity. Though, quote, little Ryan White was not an IV drug user or a promiscuous homosexual, Helms explained, he, quote, was portrayed as a typical victim, not the exception that he was. And the AIDS propaganda machine churned out the demand for special treatment and privileges for the kind of people who caused Ryan White's death. So he was implicating these other populations for Ryan White's death. He even implicates Elton John. He basically says Elton John caused Ryan White's death. Helms probably knew that his cause was futile. An already popular bill, now embellished with the name of the country's most celebrated person with AIDS, would easily pass both houses of Congress. Yet, although the strategic emphasis on a politically safe and innocent symbol may have ensured the CARE Act's passage, it also limited the scope and the scale of the legislation. The bill and the rhetoric surrounding it did not address the structural causes of the AIDS epidemic, nor did it fully acknowledge the ways in which the crisis disproportionately affected particular groups. Rather, the CARE Act's focus on sympathetic victims, not just Ryan, but primarily Ryan, fortified prevailing anti-gay, anti-drug, and other stigmas, which in turn, I would argue, contributed to the Act's funding issues and enabled the adoption or near adoption of punitive amendments during the CARE Act's 1990 passage and during its reauthorization fight in the mid-1990s. While Senator Helms's proposed ban on funding for needle exchange programs and bleach did not pass in 1990, Senator Kennedy's related amendment prohibiting federal funds for only the former did. And that amendment actually reinforced an existing federal ban on needle and syringe exchange programs, which had been introduced by Jesse Helms in 1988. Similar anti-drug and anti-gay exclusions would find their way into the CARE Act reauthorization bill in the mid-1990s, which I'll discuss in a moment. Efforts to criminalize behaviors that might lead to HIV transmission, but almost certainly will not, began in earnest in the mid-1980s, but the Ryan White CARE Act expanded and formalized such efforts. So the CARE Act represented, in the words of several scholars, an important milestone in the development of U.S. HIV exposure laws, many of which are still on the books. And if you're diagnosed with HIV, even today, you're often apprised of these laws. The Ryan White CARE Act and the criminalization statute tucked within it built on well-worn tropes imagining gay men and sex workers as sex-crazed, indiscriminate spreaders of disease who threatened so-called innocents such as Ryan White. Now, of course, despite these measures, the Ryan White CARE Act was still a monumental achievement. Inspired by White's name, image, life story, and death, the House and Senate passed their respective bills by decisive margins. After an expedited reconciliation process, the CARE Act was signed into law by President Bush on August 18, 1990, although his administration reportedly opposed the, quote, narrow disease-specific approach taken by the architects of the House bill. The final version of the bill authorized $882 million in AIDS funding for fiscal year 1991. It's about $2 billion adjusted for inflation, and $4.5 billion in federal grants through the year 1995. That's about $10.55 billion adjusted for inflation. However, debates over funding would persist well into the 1990s, and the full effects of the CARE Act's draconian anti-drug and anti-gay provisions would only become really apparent in the coming years. Just as Senator Helms had sought to block the passage of the CARE Act by aligning himself with a specific kind of innocence embodied by Ryan White, he did essentially the same thing about 5 years later during debates over the reauthorization of the CARE Act during the Clinton years. After firmly expressing his opposition to reauthorization, Helms proposed 5 amendments to the reauthorization bill in July of 1995, including Senate Amendment number 1854, expanding on existing needle exchange and and sex education bans that had been on the books since the late 1980s. The amendment stipulated that, quote, no funds authorized to be appropriated under this act may be used to promote or encourage directly or indirectly homosexuality or intravenous drug use. So basically, you can't be honest about, potential methods of transmission. This amendment passed the Senate by a vote of 54 to 45, but its explicitly anti-gay message was softened by a corresponding amendment proposed by 2 other Republican senators. This toned-down amendment, which was subsequently adopted in the final version of the reauthorization bill, read, none of the funds authorized under this title shall be used to fund AIDS programs or to develop materials designed to promote or encourage directly intravenous drug use or sexual activity, whether homosexual or heterosexual. By marking certain behaviors and populations as deviant, Helms's amendment and its watered-down companion reflected and reinforced the AIDS epidemic's, quote, hierarchy of victimhood, to use a term employed by religious studies scholar Anthony Petro. And it also revealed, I would say, the limits of the politics embodied and enabled by the Ryan White story. Despite its support for certain HIV/AIDS prevention, research, and treatment measures, the Clinton administration ultimately backed the ban on federal funding for needle and syringe exchange programs, a ban legitimated in part through uses of Ryan White's name and image. The administration's position, which ignored a significant body of research illustrating the need for and effectiveness of such programs, drew the ire of activists and organizers. AIDS activists hated Bill Clinton. He just kind of gets a pass a little bit, but they hated him. In 1998, Donna Shalala, Clinton's Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced that the benefits of such programs were undeniable. There was no question that the science was clear, she later told The Atlantic, but Clinton did not rescind the ban on federal funding. The president decided not to do it for political reasons, Shalala noted, alluding to firmly entrenched anti-drug stigmas and the stubborn belief that needle exchange programs somehow encourage intravenous drug use. After some delays, the reauthorization of the Ryan White Care Act was finalized in 1996, the same year in which the widespread adoption of protease inhibitors and highly active antiretroviral therapy caused some commentators to prematurely declare the end of AIDS. Andrew Sullivan, for one, acknowledged in November of 1996 that, quote, many Americans, especially blacks and Latinos, will still die of AIDS-related causes, while nevertheless celebrating the fact that the epidemic had entered a new, less fatal phase. As scholar and theorist Michael Warner lamented in 1999, President Bill Clinton's, quote, cynical opposition to needle exchange programs, quote, has been made easier by the general sense that AIDS is over. Accordingly, the president's rhetoric, that is President Clinton, his rhetoric on HIV/AIDS became increasingly triumphalist near the end of his second term. When he reauthorized the Ryan White Care Act again in 2000, Clinton placed the reauthorization within a linear narrative of progress on AIDS. And unsurprisingly, Ryan White and the law and the program inscribed with his name sat at the heart of this narrative. When the CARE Act was originally created, we were sadly unable to do much for those who were sick, President Clinton recalled, and I'll spare you my Bill Clinton impersonation. Thankfully, much has changed. The CARE Act is now solidly about living with HIV and AIDS. Since its last reauthorization, biomedical research has brought hope and renewed optimism with the discovery of protease inhibitors and combination therapies. The CARE Act has made the promise of biomedical research a reality in the lives of people living with HIV and AIDS in every corner of this country. For the outgoing president, quote, "Ryan White changed the world, and so has the program that bears his name." On one hand, the biomedical developments of the mid to late 1990s did make HIV and AIDS more manageable and less deadly for those with access to care. On the other, despite the claims made by Clinton, Sullivan, and others, these developments did little to challenge the stigmas that swirled around HIV and AIDS. And in fact, the rhetoric surrounding such biomedical advances, which implied what some scholars have termed the, quote, "pastness of AIDS," may have actually enhanced these stigmas. With the advent of new medicines and the widespread embrace of certain forms of medical knowledge about HIV and AIDS, alongside the growing tendency to imagine HIV and AIDS as an African problem, not a Western one, there now was simply no excuse for acquiring HIV or dying from AIDS-related causes in the United States. Since the emergence of protease inhibitors, the growing availability of highly active antiretroviral therapy, and the globalization of AIDS, and I would add the growth of PrEP and PEP, PrEP, I should say. The Ryan White story has similarly served to remind the public of the stigma and shame that once marked HIV and AIDS, but presumably no longer do. And I think Kokomo and Rocheville play a big part in this story as well. For example, a People magazine article commemorating what would have been Ryan's 50th birthday in December of 2021 noted that, quote, "White became a symbol of hope during a time when fear and misconceptions about AIDS were prevalent in the United States. But old misconceptions persist, and they've been joined by newer ones, including the notion that HIV and AIDS is somehow over or mostly over. Just as the Ryan White story has often been used to sharpen the lines between those who supposedly deserve HIV and AIDS and those who do not, narratives that relegate HIV and AIDS to the past or to Africa obscure the fact that some populations in the United States remain particularly susceptible to illness, infection, and death. It is no accident that the burdens of HIV and AIDS, 35 years after Ryan's death and the passage of the Ryan White CARE Act, continue to be borne by the most stigmatized populations in the U.S. The Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, an outgrowth of the Ryan White CARE Act, has saved and improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people living with HIV and AIDS. About 576,000 people are currently receiving medical care or other support services through the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. And some 90.6% of Ryan White clients are virally suppressed, meaning they can live longer, fuller lives, and they cannot transmit the virus. The federal legislation passed and programming implemented in Ryan's name have gone a long way toward making the HIV/AIDS epidemic less lethal. But challenges persist. Although the HIV/AIDS program, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, provides care and support for over 500,000 people, that figure represents only half of all individuals living with HIV and AIDS in the United States. Some of these individuals do not qualify for care, a consequence of our nation's patchwork and uneven healthcare system, but many others who may qualify for care simply do not receive it, either because they do not seek it out, or they don't know about these resources, or because they're unaware of their status. In the latter case, the lingering stigmas attached to HIV and AIDS continue to discourage people from getting tested. And in fact, many people do not even think to get tested, right? Further, we are witnessing a formidable attack on HIV and AIDS prevention and treatment programs at home and abroad, part of a broader assault on certain forms of medical research and knowledge. If we hope to continue curbing the HIV/AIDS epidemic, if we hope to continue saving the lives of some of the most vulnerable members of our society, and if we hope to continue writing the best parts of Ryan White's story, these developments must be challenged at every step. I'll leave it there. Thank you all so much. Yes,
Well,
you
it's
have the
time
first
for
question. Yes, yes, there is.
I wanted to ask you, you consulted both the World History Project, the Historical Society, and Western Middle School as I'm sorry. Yes, my question is, you did a lot of research in local sources such as the Oral History Project of the Howard County Historical Society and Western Middle School Library, and you said they were invaluable.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there's anything special that surprised you or in some way shaped your understanding of what was happening in Kokomo and maybe other places as well.
Well, it was all special. I will say that. But I think the responses of a lot of folks in Kokomo that were recorded through those different archives or different resources were particularly invaluable and kind of surprised me in that I wasn't expecting that much material to focus on people's response in terms of the national sort of attention, right? And yeah, I was really surprised that, Stephen Daly, for instance, wrote, I think, a 27-page response to the Ryan White story, the made-for-television movie that came out in 1989, which I think was very unfair to Kokomo and Rushville, and particularly kind of localized a lot of AIDS stigma within particular communities within Kokomo and Rushville. And it was just kind of a crude portrayal of what happened, I think. And so that response and other people's responses, I mean, folks were deeply hurt by that. And that's something I wanted to kind of do justice to in the book, right? So those resources really helped me do that. Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Other questions?
Yeah, and I can run around with maybe.
You mentioned on the first day 42% of the kids showed up.
Yeah,
Did that
42% were absent.
were absent?
Yeah,
So 58% showed up. Did attendance get better as this kept going?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that was, the low point, I would say, right? And there were some folks who started their own sort of splinter school, but that was a very small group. So yeah, attendance most certainly improved. And I think by April, when he was kind of finally totally in school, things started to bounce back almost to normal. Yeah, I think there's another hand up. Yeah.
How long do you think it would have taken the United States to address the AIDS epidemic had it not been for Ryan White?
Historians are very bad at prognosticating, and so I can't say. But I mean, it took 9 years from this moment in which the New York Times published this piece about Kaposi sarcoma cases for the Ryan White Care Act to pass. And I think a lot of activists would tell you that it would never have passed without Ryan White's name and image. Yeah, so that's probably the best I can do on that question. Thank you for that question. Yes.
How did you become interested in this story?
So this is a story that has loomed over my life. It is how I first learned about HIV and AIDS. I don't know. I think for a lot of people beyond Kokomo, Rushville, Indiana, it is people's first kind of encounter with AIDS education. And so I wasn't just interested in the Ryan White story or Ryan White as a person, but how that story gets deployed and how it serves to kind of, and I talk a lot about this in the book, how it serves to emphasize kind of kindness and tolerance as antidotes for HIV and AIDS. And I think those are most certainly part of the story, but without kind of healthcare, without a more robust sort of response, that kindness and toleration only go so far. So I really wanted to kind of unpack that and how Ryan White is used in those ways. And, this is kind of a story about me in a way. I'm not saying, people say all scholarship is autobiographical. And when I was a kid, I was pretty sickly. I didn't have hemophilia, but I was slight. I got pneumonia a bunch of times. And so in a way, I identified with Ryan. and I identified with the story, but I also knew that the story served to kind of conceal other populations that maybe were more susceptible or particularly susceptible to HIV and AIDS. And as a queer person, I felt as if this story was about me, but not about me. And so I kind of knew that every time people were talking about Ryan White, they were talking about sickly children, yes, but also they're trying to evade, bless you, any discussion of gay people, of people who use intravenous drugs. So that's why it's always kind of called to me. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yes, another one.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the 4 H's
Yes.
very momentarily, and
Yes.
I was just wondering, what about Haitians as a demographic put them in that category?
There was kind of a scare around HIV and AIDS among the Haitian population, and so that kind of put them on the map in terms of kind of HIV and AIDS and being a vulnerable population. But a lot of that was just kind of, I would say discrimination and the idea that you can kind of localize it within one nationality doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think by that point, folks were trying to, they didn't realize that it was as kind of pervasive as it already was. So the idea that you could kind of say, well, it's these populations when it had already sort of been in other populations. I mean, it's not unlike what you saw with COVID-19 where people were saying, okay, we can kind of say, oh, there's a smattering of cases here, but don't worry about it, right? It's already kind of, it's broken containment or whatever the terminology is. So that was the genesis of the 4 H's. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Good. Yeah.
You just mentioned COVID-19. So all of my siblings went to Western.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the pandemic, the school was less strict on regulations, and there was even a parent anti-mask protest.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to ask, what you make of the difference between the reaction of Ryan White having AIDS and the fear of that disease versus now it's more of a pro-choice for your children kind of messaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were so many uncertainties, I think, about HIV and AIDS at the time that I don't want to justify the response, but I think it's more understandable than a lot of the response that you see more recently, in that HIV AIDS was a death sentence, and there were still some lingering questions about communicability, transmissibility in 1985. I mean, the scientific consensus was beginning to sort of congeal and say, a lot of folks, I think the Indiana State Board of Health issued these guidelines when Ryan White was trying to go back to school, and they essentially said, and I think they got it right, they said, this cannot be transmitted through casual contact. But what constitutes casual contact? Why does the ISBH have all these really kind of stringent guidelines about how school administrators should respond in the event of a bleeding episode? That kind of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and they thought, okay, well, I mean, is there a chance that my child could contract HIV? That basically means that child is going to die within the next 5 to 10 years. Also, people didn't know about, this is right as a sort of antibody testing regime is being solidified. So, people didn't know if they had HIV or AIDS in the early to mid 1980s, and it also has an incubation period of about 10 years, or it could. So, you could contract HIV and not show any sort of purplish lesions denoting Kaposi sarcoma or anything like that for a decade. So I think the confusion, not that there wasn't confusion with COVID-19, I think it is more comparable to other things that we have witnessed in ways that HIV and AIDS were not. Not that it's completely unprecedented, but I think that's what kind of spurred a lot of that response. So, and I think a lot of those responses, I think a lot of people want to say it can be localized within certain places, Indiana or Florida or whatever, but this is kind of an impulse that is a much broader impulse, and so that's something I wanted to capture in the book. So hopefully I answered your question. But yeah.
Well, you just said something interesting to me there.
Yes.
What I find
Are you saying everything? Everything I say is interesting. Yeah.
There was interesting what you said. So based on what happened then, is that you said the Department of Health gave guidelines that
Yeah.
said, this is safe for your casual contact, here's the guidelines, we're okay.
Yeah.
With COVID recently, their issuance was, this is dangerous,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
could be the contact, but then you saw the reaction from people, and both of those instances seem to be in contradiction to those health suggestions.
Yeah.
I mean, would you then argue that these diseases and viruses are almost equally as dangerous as the public response to that?
I mean, all viruses, all diseases are political in a way, right? And so maybe not partisan necessarily, but who lives and who dies, who gets to determine when something is over. I talk a lot about that in the book, especially near the epilogue. I mean, I think an argument can be made that a lot of people's desire to put COVID behind us kind of exacerbated the crisis, and so I think in 2021 people are already saying, well, it's more or less over, when I think in the book I have this little quotation in which the president at the time, Joe Biden, in September of 22, said, the pandemic's over. 12,000 people died of COVID-19 that month in the United States. So, I mean, over for whom, right? So I think there also is this, to go back to your question, there's this desire, and kind of to go back to my my response a little bit, there's this desire to say, well, it's a kind of grassroots resistance to a lot of this stuff, but the idea that people want to socialize, people don't want to be stuck in their houses, right? There's this kind of natural sort of human, and I'm not saying that this is understandable.
I guess what I just found was interesting.
Yeah, the tension there.
The tension was, and it's opposite.
Yeah.
It's that the health department, the experts, the scientists have
Yeah.
said, this is fine.
Yeah.
We're safe to do this. And they said,
Yeah.
and then the public said, no, we're not.
Yeah.
And then with COVID, it was, hey, this isn't safe. Probably shouldn't be around each other.
Right.
They said, no, you're wrong.
Yeah,
You should
yeah.
be. I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting tension. I mean, I think there is resistance to and skepticism of the medical establishment in not just the United States, but beyond. And some of that is kind of understandable. I think some of it is excessive and ridiculous. But I think a lot of people in the community here also wanted to. I think they weren't wrong when they said, we know a lot about HIV and AIDS. They did demonstrate that they knew quite a bit about HIV and AIDS. But yeah, there was a skepticism, and I think some of that is, it kind of stems from just the clear kind of lethal nature of HIV and AIDS. But yeah, that tension is interesting, right?
So do you think we've learned anything from these experiences, including this one? Like, do you think the next time something similar to AIDS comes up, do you think we've learned anything?
I'm a pessimist by nature. I think by studying, history's all depressing. People always ask me, why do you write about such depressing things? But, history is depressing inherently, I think. It's a story about humans being cruel to one another, more or less. And I think there's something kind of beautiful about Ryan's story. And I think it could be used, and I get at this in the epilogue to the book, it could be used for this kind of more expansive vision of caring for one another and all that good stuff. But I think more often than not, this story was deployed for nefarious purposes. I don't think we've learned anything necessarily. And there are myriad different lessons you could take from something like this. But I think COVID is exhibit A of how we didn't learn from HIV and AIDS, or Mpox is another example, which I talk about in the epilogue. I think I saw a couple hands up.
Yeah, I think we have time for just one more question.
Make it good. I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
I was just curious, and maybe you discussed it in the book, and I don't know, but there was a parallel where good did come, right, that I feel like did impact COVID-19, and like just to put a different light, did you notice or did you discuss the parallel work that the CDC did with universal and standard precautions that came out of that?
The HIV epidemic?
Yes, so that's big work from a scientific that was studied, and it is standard worldwide.
Yeah.
And has changed the way we practice self-quick care every day. Wearing gloves, for
Yep.
instance, when we draw blood.
Right.
Washing our hands in and out, and not that those things weren't happening always, but under certain circumstances, right? And
Right.
so they went from standard or universal precautions in, I think, 1985, and then like 1990 something, they became universal
Yeah.
or standard.
Yeah.
But we did that for everyone. But those precautions are used in all these infectious diseases and infections, which is cool. But I was just curious, did you notice that when you were studying the timelines,
Mm-hmm.
that there was parallel work going on outside of Congress, but that was just kind of really changing the world in a way that we weren't really talking about unless you worked in that healthcare community? I was a child, I went to school with them, so I was just scared all the time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but as a healthcare professional, that story impacts what we do every day.
Absolutely,
So-
yeah. No, that's important to note. It's not something I really talk about a lot in the book. I talk a lot about how kind of activists are petitioning for a lot of these different measures, and just a more robust response from the state. The CDC didn't kind of include women in their case definition of HIV and AIDS, right? So basically, women were not acknowledged as people who could potentially get HIV and AIDS, and that's a huge problem, right? That, I think, often gets overlooked in the Ryan White story, but you're completely right. It's integral to the story. If we kind of take a capacious understanding or a capacious view of that story. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Paul. Let's give him a round of applause. It's a wonderful lecture. And also, I want to thank you again for coming today. Before you leave, I have 2 quick announcements. First, we have 10 copies of Paul's book. Paul will definitely sign them for you. If you're interested, you can stay. The second announcement is for those friends from our community. I just want to share, all Indiana residents, of course, include you, are eligible to get a IU Kokomo Library card. So with that card, you will be able to check out our items and get computer guest accounts to use our resources. All right, I hope to see you guys back soon for an event or just be in the library. And thank you. Yeah.
And if I could, before you leave, can I take a selfie with all of you? Okay, yes.